I feel like reading a few excerpts from Hunter S. Thompson's writings on the Watergate scandal, mostly leading up to what people thought was going to be some sort of a trial or a congressional ruling about it before things ended up unfolding the way they did. Just because I've been enjoying his writing a lot lately, his political writing a lot lately. And I'll jump around a bit, but there's a lot of fun language and there's a lot of cool storytelling that I always enjoy revisiting. Gives me a view into the America that existed before I was born and or while I was very, very small. And I like that kind of stuff. A spot that I want to start with here. There are a lot of people in this country, editors, congressmen, and lawyers, among others, who like themselves a lot better today for the way they reacted when the Watergate octopus got hold of them. There are also a lot of people who got dragged down forever by it, which is probably just as well for the rest of us, because many of them were exposed as either dangerous bunglers, ruthless swine, or both. Others, many of them peripherally involved in one aspect or another of Watergate, but lucky enough not to get caught, will probably be haunted by a sense of nervous guilt for a while, but in a year or two they will forget about it. These, in a way, are almost as dangerous as the ones who are going to jail, because they are the good Germans among us, the ones who made it all possible. I've been trying to finish The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich for at least the last 3 months, hauling the huge bugger along in my baggage to places like Buffalo, Oakland, Ann Arbor, Houston, and finally all the way down to the jungles and lost fishing villages of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. But things have been happening too fast, and there was never enough time or privacy to get seriously into the thing. So not even down in the Yucatan, lying around in big hammocks in 50 peso a night hotels where we had to keep the Hong Kong-built ceiling fans cranked up to top speed for enough wind in the room to drive the roaches back into the corners. At one point, I tried to read it in a hotel room near the ruins of the Mayan civilization in Chichen Itza, thinking to get a certain weird perspective on American politics in the 70s by pondering the collapse of the 1,000-year Reich, while sitting in the stone remnants of another and totally different culture that survived for more than 1,000 years before anybody in Europe even knew a place called America existed. The Aztec socio-political structure was a fine-tuned elitist democracy that would have embarrassed everybody connected with either the French or American revolutions. The ancient Greeks and Romans seem like crude punks compared to what the Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas put together in Mexico and South America in the 20 or so centuries between 500 BC and the ill-fated Spanish conquest in 1525. The Mayan calendar, devised several centuries before the birth of Christ, is still more precise than the one we use today. They had the solar year broken down to exactly 365.24 days and 12 lunar months of 29.5 days each. None of this sloppy leap year business or odd number months. According to most military experts, Adolf Hitler went over the hump somewhere around the middle of 1942. At that point, even according to Albert Speer, his personal architect and all-around technical wizard, the Reich was already spread too thin. Militarily, financially, industrially, politically, and every other way. Speer had all the blueprints, the plans, the figures, and an almost daily fix on what was happening to boiling Hitler's head. Given all that, Speer says he knew in his heart that they were headed downhill after the summer of 42. But it was almost 3 years and at least 3 million deaths later that Hitler finally admitted what Speer, one of his closest friends and advisors, says he knew all along. Or at least during those last 3 years when Albert and all the other in the Führer's inner circle were working 20, 22, and sometimes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to keep the Reich propped up on an ever-eroding base of conquered slave labor and frenzied schemes to create a superweapon that would somehow turn the tide. None of his rotten madness worked out, of course, and as a reward for his stupid loyalty to Hitler, Albert Speer spent 20 years of his life locked up in Spandau prison as one of Germany's major war criminals. Hitler was consistent to the end. He had no stomach for jail cells or courtrooms unless they were his. So as soon as he got word that Russo-American tanks were rumbling into the suburbs of Berlin, he went down in his private bunker and killed it both himself and his faithful mistress, Eva Braun, with what some people say was a very elegant gold-plated Walther machine pistol. Nobody knows for sure, because the bunker was ravaged by fire soon afterward, And the only alleged witness to Hitler's death was his personal aide and advisor, Martin Bormann, who either escaped at the last moment or was burned to such an unrecognizable cinder that his body was never found. Everyone who knew Bormann hated and feared him. Even Hitler, who apparently treated him like a pet cobra. And few of the Reich's survivors ever accepted the fact of his death in that fiery bunker. He was too evil and crafty for that. They insisted... Too evil and crafty for that, they insisted. And the general assumption was that Bormann had kept his personal escape plan finely organized on a day-to-day basis since the winter of 43. West German military intelligence now lists him as officially dead. But not that many people believe it, because he keeps turning up now and then in places like Asuncion, Paraguay, the Brazilian Mato Grosso, or high in the Argentine Lake Country. Bormann was the Tex Coulson of his time, and his strange relationship with Hitler seems not much different from the paranoid fragments of the Nixon-Coulson relationship that emerged from the now infamous White House transcripts of April 1974. We are drifting into some ugly parallels here. And if I'd written this kind of thing 2 years ago, I've expected to pick up the New York Times a week later and see myself mangled all over the op-ed page by Pat Buchanan, and then beaten into a bloody coma the next evening by some of Coulson's hired thugs in an alley behind the National Press Building, a long stone's throw, as it were, from the White House. But like Tommy Rush says, times ain't now, but like they used to be. Which is true. There is not much doubt about that. But after watching the TV news on all three networks last night and then reading all the Nixon stories in today's Washington Post, I have an eerie feeling that the times ain't now quite like they appear to be either. There was something oddly hollow and out of focus about last night's main TV news story on the U.S. Supreme Court's dramatic and potentially ominous decision to postpone its traditional June recess and stay on through July to render what will clearly be an historic judgment, one way or another, on Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski's either bold or desperate leapfrog attempt to force an immediate high court decision on President Nixon's right to ignore a subpoena for 64 tape recordings and other White House documents from a special prosecutor appointed under extremely sensitive circumstances by the U.S. Senate, with his independence explicitly guaranteed by the new U.S. Attorney General as a condition of his taking office. All three networks treated this latest development in the strange and terrible saga of Richard Nixon as a staggering and perhaps even fatal blow to his chances of survival in the White House. The mere fact that the court was willing to stay over and hear Jaworski's argument, they implied, was a sure sign that at least four of the justices, enough in this case, were prepared to rule. Just as soon as the question is formally presented against Nixon's claim of executive privilege with regard to Jaworski's subpoena. The special prosecutor had apparently won a major victory, and the president was in very deep trouble. Only David Schumacher on ABC hinted very briefly. There had been no victory celebrations among Jaworski's staff that afternoon, but he didn't say why. And frankly, I'll be fucked if I can either. I brooded on it for a while, but all that came to mind was some half-remembered snarl from the lips of President Andrew Jackson when the Supreme Court ruled against him on some kind of question involving federal land grant to the Seminole Indians. Jackson, a veteran Indian fighter, took the ruling as a personal insult. Well, he said, the judges have made their decision. Now let them enforce it. Joseph Stalin, 100 years later, had similar views with regard to the Roman Catholic Church. He had gone into one of his rages, according to the story as I heard it, and this one had something to do with the notion that seized him after 5 days and nights in a brutal vodka orgy that every Catholic in Moscow should be nailed up on a telephone pole by dawn on Easter Sunday. This announcement caused genuine fear in the Kremlin because Stalin, like Coulson, was known by his staff to be capable of almost anything. When he calmed down a bit, one of his advisors suggested a mass crucifixion of Russian Catholics for no reason at all would almost certainly raise hackles in the Vatican and no doubt anger the Pope. Fuck the Pope, Stalin mumbled. How many divisions does he have? These stories are hard to nail down with any real certainty, but there is a mean kind of consistency in the punchlines that makes them hard to forget, especially when you start pondering the spectacle of a borderline psychotic with the brain of a small-time chiseler and the power to literally blow up the world, never more than 60 seconds away from his gnawed red fingertips, doing everything he can to force a hellish confrontation with the highest judicial and legislative authorities in his own country. This is what Nixon has been trying to do for at least the past 3 months. And if Stuart Aslop was right, since July 18th of last year, that was the Wednesday meeting at the White House, he said, when it was agreed unanimously that the tapes should not be released. I would like to have talked with Stuart Aslop about that meeting, but he died last month of leukemia. After writing very candidly and even casually, at times, about his impending death from a disease that he had known for at least 2 years was slowly and steadily killing him. I didn't know him personally, and as a journalist, I rarely agreed with him, but there was an uncommon sense of integrity and personal commitment in everything he wrote, and an incredible sense of style, strength, and courage in the way he chose to die. Stuart Aslop, for all his experience in politics and all his friends in every Erie in Washington, choose the one that's correct, please, seemed baffled all the way to his grave by the reality of Watergate and its foul implications for some of the ideas and people he believed in. As one of Washington's ranking journalists, he was privy to things like that meeting last July at the White House, where Nixon and a handful of others sat down to give serious thought to all their possible options with regard to those reels of harmless-looking celluloid that had suddenly turned into time bombs. Aslop could understand all the facts of a scene like that, but not the reality. Like most of the people he grew up with, Stuart Aslop was born a Republican. It was as much a way of life as a thought-out political philosophy, and along with all the privileges came a certain sense of noblesse oblige. Aslop understood these things, which explains probably better than anything else why it was almost genetically impossible for him to come to grips with the idea that the Oval Office of the White House, under a second-term Republican president, who had also been a Republican vice president, senator, and congressman, was in fact a den of thieves, fixers, and felons. This kind of savage reality was too much for a 60-year-old elitist Republican like Stuart Aslop to cope with. It was like showing up at the White House for your monthly chat with the president on some normal afternoon and finding the Oval Office full of drunken Hell's Angels. And the president, so stoned on reds he can't even recognize you, babbling distractedly and shoveling big mounds of white powder around the desk with the butt of a sawed-off shotgun. There are not many senior political columnists in Washington who could handle a scene like that. Their minds would refuse to accept it. For the same reason they still can't accept the stark and fearful truth that President Richard Milhouse Nixon is not only going to be impeached, but he actually wants to be impeached immediately. This is probably the one simple fact right now in a story that is going to become so heinously complicated in the next few months that every reporter assigned to it will need to both a shrewd criminal lawyer and a scholar in the field of constitutional law right next to him or her at all times. There's no question at all, even now, in these last moments of calm before the shit rain starts, that this Nixon impeachment saga is going to turn some of the best minds in American journalism to mush before it's over. And that statement will just have to sit there. I refuse to even try to explain it. There will be plenty of time for that. Thousands of hours in God only knows how many courtrooms, and Nixon will eventually be impeached, if only because he has the leverage to put the House of Representatives in a position where it will have no other choice. Nixon's lawyers, who have already cost the taxpayers nearly $400,000 in legal fees, have now abandoned all pretense in their efforts to insult and provoke Congressman Peter Rodino's House Judiciary Committee into exactly the kind of quick, angry, and ill-considered vote for impeachment that Rodino, pick whichever one is correct, and committee counsels John Doerr and Albert Jenner have been bending over backward to avoid, till they can put together enough evidence before the hearings are open to the public and the full House convenes on TV to hear the charges, to build a far more solid and serious case for impeachment than the one they appear to have now. Nixon would like nothing better than to stampede the House of Representatives into a televised yay or nay showdown based on charges no more serious than contempt of Congress, contempt of courts, and by implication, the grossest kind of contempt for everybody in the country with an IQ higher than 50. But not even Ron Ziegler is counting on a farce of that magnitude. On May 27th, the UPI Wire carried an official statement by Ziegler from Key Biscayne to the effect that formal impeachment proceedings against the boss would come as no surprise to him, nor would impeachment itself, he implied. So why don't they just get on with it? Why indeed? Goes on to talk about the tapes, a stonewalling strategy, Special Prosecutor Jaworski, some speculation about how they might behave, and the test that would come in the Senate where Nixon could afford a 2-to-1 point spread against him and could still, could probably beat the rap. Talk about how many votes certain people would need to get together. Anyway, what Nixon understands about all of this, and he says there are 100 or more people wandering around Washington today who have heard the real stuff, as they put it. And despite their professional caution, when the obvious question arises, there is one reaction they all feel free to agree on, that nobody who felt shocked, depressed, or even angry after reading the edited White House transcripts should ever be allowed to hear the actual tapes. Except under heavy sedation or locked in the trunk of a car. Only a terminal cynic, they say, can listen for any length of time to the real stuff without feeling a compulsion to do something like drive down to the White House and throw a bag of live rats over the fence. Yes, looking back at the line I just wrote, it occurs to me that almost half the people I know have been feeling that kind of compulsion almost steadily for the last 8 or 9 years. My friend Yale Bluer, for instance, claims to have thrown a whole garbage can full of live rats, roaches, and assorted small vermin over the White House fence about a week before Lyndon Johnson announced his retirement in 1968. It was a wonderful feeling, he says. But only because it was Johnson. I knew, for some reason, that he would really hate the sight of big rats on the White House lawn. He paused and reached for his snuff box, taking a big hit of Dr. Johnson's best in each nostril. I'm not sure why, he went on, but I wouldn't get any satisfaction out of doing a thing like that to Nixon. He might actually like rats. Mother of babbling God, I just took a break from this gibberish long enough to watch the evening news. And there was the face and voice of Tex Coulson, jolting a Washington courtroom with a totally unforeseen confession of guilt on one count of obstruction of justice in return, on the basis of an elaborately covered TV statement on the subject of his own guilt, and deep involvement in almost every aspect of Watergate, for the opportunity to take whatever punishment he deserves and purge himself once and for all by telling everything I know about many things I have not been able to talk freely about until now. Coulson, of all people! First he converts to Jesus, and now he's copying a plea and holding a press conference on national TV to announce that he intends to confess everything. Which means, apparently, that he is now available to testify for the prosecution in every Watergate-related trial from now until all his old friends and conspirators are either put behind bars with a Gideon Bible in their hands or standing in line at a soup kitchen in Butte, Montana. What will Nixon make of this freak-out? Tex Coulson, one of the most unprincipled thugs in the history of American politics, was supposed to be a main link in the unbreakable and fatally interdependent inner circle, along with Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Nixon, who wouldn't think twice about stonewalling God. Let me try that again. Take two. Nixon, who wouldn't think twice about stonewalling God himself. Use take two. Not even Richard Nixon, at the peak of his power and popularity, felt comfortable with the knowledge that a monster like Coulson had an office in the White House. Nixon felt so strongly about Coulson's savagery, in fact, that he went out of his way to defame him by deliberately publishing some of his own harsh judgments on Coulson's total lack of any sense of ethics or morality in the official White House transcripts. And Nixon's speechwriter Pat Buchanan, widely regarded as one of the most aggressive hardline right-wingers since Joseph Goebbels, once described Coulson as the meanest man in American politics, which is no small compliment coming from Buchanan, who has spent the better part of his last decade working with some of the meanest and most congenitally fascistic bastards ever to work for any government. I will have to call Buchanan tomorrow and ask him what he thinks about Tex Coulson now. As a matter of fact, I will have to call a lot of people tomorrow about this thing, because if Coulson really is serious about telling everything he knows, Richard Nixon is in very deep trouble. He may as well go out on Pennsylvania Avenue tomorrow and start peddling those tapes to the highest bidder, because Coulson knows enough ugly stories about the Nixon regime to make most of the talk on those tapes seem like harmless cocktail gossip. At a glance, there are two ways to view Coulson's breakdown. One is to take his conversion to Jesus seriously, which is difficult, and the other is to take it as a warning that even the president should have better sense than to cross the meanest man in American politics. There's another way to interpret it, but that will have to wait for later. Along with a lot of other things, this is not the kind of story to try to cope with while roaming back and forth across the country in jet airliners. Although there is nothing in any of the current journalism out of Washington, on the tube or in print, to indicate that it is any easier to cope with there than in Key, Biscayne, Calgary, or even Mexico City. The entire Washington press corps seems at least temporarily paralyzed by the sheer magnitude and complexity of the thing. It will be a nasty story to cover, especially in the swamp-like humidity of a Washington summer. But it is definitely worth watching and perhaps even being a part of, because whatever kind of judgment and harsh reality finally emerges will be a historical landmark in the calendar of civilizations and a beacon for good or ill. To all the generations that will inherit the earth or whatever we leave of it, just as surely as we inherited it from the Greeks and the Romans, the Mayans and the Incas, and even from the 1,000-year Reich. The impeachment of Richard Nixon will end in a trial that will generate an interminable blizzard of headlines, millions of dollars worth of media coverage, and a verdict that will not matter nearly as much to the defendant as it will to the jurors. By the time the trial starts, assuming that Nixon can sustain his lifelong appetite for humiliation that has never been properly gratified, the fate of Nixon himself will have shrunk to the dimensions of a freakish little side effect. The short-lived disaster of his presidency is already neutralized, and the outcome of his impeachment ordeal will have very little effect on his role in tomorrow's history texts. He'll be grouped, along with presidents like Grant and Harding, as a corrupt and incompetent mockery of the American dream he praised so long and loud in all his speeches. Not just a crook, but so crooked that he required the help of a personal valet to screw his pants on every morning. By the time Richard Milhous Nixon goes on trial in the Senate, the only reason for trying him will be to understand how he ever became president of the United States at all. And the real defendant at that point will be the American political system. The trial of Richard Nixon, if it happens, will amount to a de facto trial of the American dream. The importance of Nixon is now not merely to get rid of him. That's a strictly political consideration. The real question is why we are being forced to impeach a president elected by the largest margin in the history of presidential elections. So with the need for sleep coming up very fast now, we want to look at two main considerations. One, the necessity of actually bringing Nixon to trial in order to understand our reality in the same way the Nuremberg trials forced Germany to confront itself. And two, the absolutely vital necessity of filling the vacuum that the Nixon impeachment will leave. And that hole will be there in 1976. Rolling Stone, July 4th, 1974. And that was from the article titled Fear and Loathing in Washington, The Boys in the Bag, which I skipped some of the intro to. But now, hold on to your butts. Fear and loathing in limbo, the scum also rises. Before I could come to any conclusion, it occurred to me that my speech or my silence, indeed any action of mine, would be a mere futility. What did it matter what anyone knew or ignored? What did it matter who was manager? One gets sometimes such a flash of insight. The essentials of this affair lay deep under the surface, beyond my reach and beyond my power of meddling. Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness. Well, this is going to be difficult. That sold-out knucklehead refugee from a 1969 Mr. Clean TV commercial has just done what only the most cynical and paranoid kind of malcontent ever connected with national politics would have dared to predict. If I followed my better instincts right now, I would put this typewriter in the Volvo and drive to the home of the nearest politician, any politician, and hurl the goddamn machine through his front window. Flush the bugger out with an act of lunatic violence and then soak him down with mace. And run him naked down Main Street in Aspen with a bell around his neck and black lumps all over his body from jolts of a high-powered bull-buster cattle prod. But old age has either mellowed me or broken my spirit to the point where I will probably not do that. At least not today. Because that blundering dupe in the White House has just plunged me into a deep and vicious hole. About 5 hours after I'd sent the final draft of a massive article on the demise of Richard Nixon off on the Mojo Wire, which is an early version of the fax machine, into the cold maw of the typesetter in San Francisco, Gerald Ford called a press conference in Washington to announce that he had just granted a full, free, and absolute presidential pardon, covering any and all crimes Richard Nixon may or may not have committed during the entire 5.5 years of his presidency. Ford sprung this decision with no advance warning at 10:40 on a peaceful Sunday morning in Washington, after emerging from a church service with such a powerful desire to dispense mercy that he rushed back to the White House, a short hump across Lafayette Park, and summoned a weary Sunday morning skeleton crew of correspondents and cameramen to inform them, speaking in curiously zombie-like tones, that he could no longer tolerate the idea of ex-President Nixon suffering in grief-crazed solitude out there on a beach in San Clemente, and that his conscience now compelled him to end both the suffering of Nixon and the national angst it was causing by means of a presidential edict such a king-sized breadth and scope as to scourge the poison of Watergate from our national consciousness forever. Or at least that's how it sounded to me when I was jolted out of a sweat-soaked coma on Sunday morning by a frantic phone call from Dick Tuck. "Ford pardoned the bastard," he screamed. "I warned you, didn't I? I buried him twice, and he came back from the dead both times. Now he's done it again. He's running around loose on some private golf course in Palm Desert." I fell back on the bed, moaning heavily. No, I thought, I didn't hear that. Ford had gone out of his way during his first White House press conference to impress both the Washington press corps and the national TV audience with his carefully considered refusal to interfere in any way with Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski's legal duty to proceed on the basis of evidence and prosecute any and all individuals. Given the context of the question, Ford's reply was widely interpreted as a signal to Jaworski that the former president should not be given any special treatment. And it also meshed with Ford's answer to a question in the course of his confirmation hearings in the Senate a few months earlier, when he'd said, "I don't think the public would stand for it," when asked if an appointed vice president would have the power to pardon the president who had appointed him if the president were removed from office under criminal circumstances. I recall these things Ford had said, but I was not so sure I'd heard Dick Tuck correctly, or if I'd really heard them at all. I held my right hand up in front of my eyes, trying to remember if I'd eaten anything the night before that could cause hallucinations. If so, my hand would appear to be transparent, and I would be able to see all the bones and blood vessels very clearly. But my hand was not transparent. I moaned again, bringing Sandy in from the kitchen to find out what was wrong. "Did Chuck just call?" I asked. She nodded. "He was almost hysterical. Ford just gave Nixon a full pardon." I sat up quickly, groping around the bed for something to smash. "No," I shouted. "That's impossible." She shook her head. "I heard it on the radio, too." I stared at my hands again, feeling anger behind my eyes and noise coming up in my throat. "That stupid, lying bastard! Jesus, who votes for these treacherous scumbags? You can't even trust the dumb ones. Look at Ford. He's too goddamn stupid to arrange a deal like that. Hell, he's almost too stupid to live." Sandy shrugged. "He gave Nixon all the tapes, too." "Holy shit!" I leaped out of bed and went quickly to the phone. "What's Goodwin's number in Washington? That bonehead Rotarian son of a bitch made a deal? Maybe Dick knows something." But it was 24 hours later when I finally got a hold of Goodwin, and by the time I had made a huge chart of dates, names, and personal connections, all linked, cross-linked by a maze of arrows and lines, the three names on the list, with far more connections than any others, were Laird, Kissinger, and Rockefeller. I had spent all night working feverishly on the chart, and now I was asking Goodwin to have a researcher check it all out. "Well," he replied, "a lot of people in Washington are thinking along those same lines today. No doubt there was some kind of arrangement, but..." He paused. "Aren't we pretty damn close to the deadline? Jesus Christ, you'll never be able to check all that stuff before..." "Mother of babbling God," I muttered. The word deadline caused my brain to seize up momentarily. Deadline? Yes. Tomorrow morning. About 15 more hours. With about 90% of my story already set in type, one of the threads that ran all the way through it was my belief that nothing short of nuclear war could prevent Nixon's conviction. The only thing wrong with that argument was its tripod construction. And one of the three main pillars was my assumption that Gerald Ford had not been lying when he'd said more than once, for the record, he had no intention of considering a presidential pardon for Richard Nixon until the legal process had run its course. Kazart. I hung up the phone and tossed my chart across the room. That rotten, sadistic little thief had done it again. Just 1 month earlier, he had sandbagged me by resigning so close to the deadline that I almost had a nervous breakdown while failing completely. And now he was doing it again, with his goddamn presidential pardon leaving me with less than 24 hours to revise it completely, a 15,000-word story that was already set in type. It was absolutely impossible. No hope at all, except to lash as many last-minute pages as possible into the mojo and hope for the best. Maybe somebody in San Francisco would have time, when the deadline crunch came, to knit the two versions together. But there was no way at all to be sure, so this will be an interesting article to read when it comes off the press. Indeed, cast your bread on the waters. Why not? I was brooding on this and cursing Nixon more out of habit than logic for his eerie ability to make life difficult for me, when it suddenly occurred to me that the villain this time was not Nixon, but Gerald Ford. He was the one who decided to pardon Nixon for reasons we can hopefully deal with later. On August 30th, when he instructed his White House counsel, Philip Buchan, to work out the legal details and consult with Nixon's new defense lawyer, John Miller, one-time campaign aide to Robert Kennedy. Incredibly, Miller informed Buchan that he would have to make sure a presidential pardon was acceptable to Nixon. And 24 hours later, he came back with the word that the ex-president, whose condition had been publicly described by anonymous friends that week as almost terminally disturbed and depressed at the prospect of his imminent indictment by Jaworski's grand jury, had been able to get a grip on himself long enough to decide that he would not be offended by the offer of a full presidential pardon, just as long as the offer also granted Nixon sole ownership and control of all the White House tapes. Ford quickly agreed, a concession that could mean $5 million or more to Nixon. He can milk them for the bulk of his presidential memoirs, for which his new agent claims already to have been offered $2 million advance, and after that he has the legal right either to destroy the tapes or sell them to the highest bidder. Arrangements for the presidential pardon were not completed until Friday, September 6th, and only then after President Ford sent his personal emissary, Benton L. Becker, out to San Clemente to make sure things went smoothly. Background on Becker then, and the IRS, the Justice Department. Most of my friends have been under investigation at one time or another in the past 10 years or so. And my own FBI file dates back to at least 1958, when I refused to accept a security clearance from the Air Force on the grounds that I didn't honestly consider myself a good security risk because I disagreed strongly with the slogan, "My country, right or wrong." My clearance was not granted, but I was never hassled about it. And instead of being sent to a top-secret radar installation near the Arctic Circle, I was passed over for promotion and placed in a job as a sports editor of a base newspaper on the Gulf Coast of Florida. But we seem to be wandering here. I was talking about Benton Becker and his delicate task of negotiating the details of a full presidential pardon for Richard Nixon, whose tragic mental condition was even then being slandered almost daily at this stage of the pardon by unnamed friends and advisors. At this point in the pardon negotiations, both Ford and Nixon had learned that Jaworski's grand jury planned to indict the ex-president on as many as 10 counts. An ugly prospect that led Ford to suggest that Nixon might temper the grand jury's aggressive attitude by volunteering to admit at least some small measure of guilt for his role in the Watergate cover-up in exchange for the pardon that would give him total immunity from prosecution anyway, regardless of what he admitted. This suggestion almost torpedoed the negotiations. Nixon angrily rejected it, says one of Ford's White House advisors. And then his mood changes after a couple days. Becker's excited. The new president received the news gratefully and scheduled a short press conference on Sunday to lay the fine news on his public. Yeah, I know. There is something just a little bit weird about that story, but I don't have time to check on it right now. All the details, however, have appeared in one form or another in either the Washington Post or the Washington Star News. And then later on, towards the end of this article, my interest in national politics withered drastically within hours after Nixon resigned. After 5.5 years of watching a gang of fascist thugs treating the White House and the whole machinery of the federal government like a conquered empire to be used like the spoils of war for any purpose that served either the needs or whims of the victors, the prospect of some harmless, half-bright jock like Jerry Ford running a cautious, caretaker-style government for 2 or even 6 years was almost a welcome relief. Not even the ominous sight of Vice President Nelson Rockefeller hovering a heartbeat away from the presidency had much effect on my head. After more than 10 years of civil war with the White House and all the swine who either lived or worked there, I was ready to give the benefit of the doubt to almost any president who acted half human and had enough sense not to walk around in public wearing a swastika armband.
Oh, fuck yeah. Oh, fuck yeah.